Hi, my name is Matthew Bietz. I'm an assistant research professor at the University of California, Irvine in the Department of Informatics, and I'm also one of the fellows here at the Pufendorf Institute, where I'm part of this year's data theme. My background is in studying the ways that researchers collaborate around data, what I sometimes call data-centric collaboration, and thinking a lot about the ways that the data serve as a collaborative artifact that is shared, that moves around, that travels from place to place. And I like to think about what happens when that data moves. But recently I've been interested in a new form of data that's been happening and is around us a lot. That what we have been calling personal data sometimes. Basically the idea that we're in a world now where data is collected about us all the time. We may not understand or even know how much data is being collected. And there are some places where this becomes quite obvious. For example, I wear a Fitbit. This is one of the devices that counts how active you are during the day. But our cell phones are also collecting all kinds of information about us through the different apps, but also in the background, even through things like which Wi-Fi networks we connect to. That data is being collected not only on our phone, but by those networks themselves. As we move through a space, our phone can be tracked by the different Wi-Fi networks that are in that space. We also have a variety of other kinds of data collection going on. For example, not only these kinds of devices that are designed to collect data about us, but you think about things like your social networks, Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. Every time we post there, we're creating data, a data trail that is kind of a track that we leave that shows what we've been doing, but also can say something about what we were thinking about or what was important for us at the time. There are increasingly a number of apps that think about that collect that kind of data about us as well. But today, there's a lot of interest in what's called the Internet of Things, the ways that we're kind of creating smart environments, smart houses. And you think about things like the Nest thermostat, a smart thermostat that uses sensors to determine whether or not people are in a space to set the temperature for the heating system, or a smart refrigerator that might track what kind of food you have in it, or a smart bed that captures information about how well you slept at night. And when we can put that information together and use it, there's a lot of knowledge that we could glean about people's lifestyles, about their behaviors, to understand what they do, how people interact with each other, to answer questions that we have about things like public health. How do we keep people healthy before they get to the hospital? That's a really important question. It's been hard to collect data about that period before people get into clinical care. These kinds of devices and data streams might tell us something about that. But it can be difficult to use those data streams. For example, when you look at this, each of these different devices is created by a different company. And so getting access to the data, using that data, requires collaborating between academic researchers and corporations that are actually building these devices and collecting the data from them, and thinking about how to create those kinds of cooperations where you can work together to use that data and understand what's in it. I think also there's an issue here about how do we understand this data that may come from a relatively, what we sometimes refer to as a noisy source. When we collect data, typically in research, we're very careful to collect exactly the data that we need and to collect it in exactly the way that we need, and are very careful to make sure that we're not interfering or doing something wrong in that collection process. Well, here the data collection is mostly out of the researcher's hands. They don't have the ability to tightly control how the data get collected. And if you think about something like a refrigerator that may have sensors embedded in it, well, it may be information about the person you're interested in, but it may also be information about their family members, or even about the pet that lives in the house, or a neighbor who happens to leave something in the refrigerator. And so there becomes a question about what exactly does that data mean. And we need new techniques to think about how to use this data to answer the kinds of questions we have. But I think one of the biggest challenges that we have with using this kind of data are that it creates big privacy and ethical issues. We aren't sure how to really anonymize this kind of data. It can reveal a lot more than we expect it to. Think, for example, about the information that you post to your social network site that you think maybe only your friends and family may see now being used by researchers. We don't yet know how to get consent for research on the scale of these kinds of devices, where we may have millions of people using the device instead of just the tens or hundreds that we might enroll in a study normally. So there are a lot of interesting challenges there that we still have to deal with. And this data is shared back to through my cell phone with the Fitbit company. But it can be quite interesting to see sort of how many steps you've taken. But this data comes from a lot of other sources as well. We have social media data. Every time you post on Facebook or on Twitter or on Instagram, that leaves a data trail behind, kind of a record of what you've been doing in that space. We also have all around us other forms of data collection that we aren't so much aware of. For example, our cell phones are always collecting a lot of data about us. They've got a lot of the apps that we use collect data. They share that data back with the people who've designed the apps, but there are other ways that the phone collects data as well. For example, every time your phone passes a Wi-Fi hotspot, it registers at that hotspot with a unique address so that your phone can actually be tracked through space and time as you move around from the hotspot connections that are there. We also know there's a lot of interest in the Internet of Things, or IoT. These are the set of devices that are being thought about as smart homes or smart cities or smart spaces where we use sensors to understand quite a bit about how or what's going on in a space and to control what's going on. Think, for example, about a smart thermostat that can understand whether or not people are in the home and adjust the temperature in the home accordingly. What becomes interesting is that these devices, they're creating data as part of their purpose. So we're creating that data on Twitter in order to communicate with other people. We're creating that data from a smart thermostat in order to control and to save energy from the way that our houses are heated. But they also have what I would sometimes call data exhaust. There's a lot of data left over from that process. Researchers are getting excited about these as new forms of data. This data exhaust could actually tell us quite a lot about people's behaviors and lifestyles and health in ways that we've never been able to understand before. Essentially, what we have with these are a glimpse into the everyday lives of people that has been really hard to come by for researchers. And this has a potential to really revolutionize social science, to revolutionize health and medicine and public health, to change the ways that we think about what people are, how they behave in the world, how our world works. And getting an access to this kind of data, seems like it could be a really important thing for researchers. Let me give you an example. I work a lot with people in the realm of health. And health data, medical data, has a unique problem, which is that most of our data about people's health comes from after people are already sick. We know a lot about people after they go to the doctor, after they go to the hospital. And so our data tends to be focused on how do we fix diseases once they have occurred. What I find interesting is the idea that we could actually think about the question of what are the things that lead to disease? How do we prevent disease? With this new form of data, we can understand lifestyles not just of people once they are sick, but actually of people while they are healthy, and understand behaviors. Let me give you an example. Right now we know, for example, there are some people who are studying sleep research who are very interested in the idea that one of the reasons that people may have insomnia is because of something they call sleep hygiene, and in particular that they're using their cell phones and their new devices and their tablets and computers too late in the day. And that's doing a number of things. One of the things is that the particular kind of light that comes from your screens actually may disrupt your sleep cycle. It can also get you into a routine where, for example, your bedroom is thought of not just as a place for sleep, but as a place to do work or to communicate. And that can disrupt the way that we sleep. But it's really difficult to tell if this is the cause of somebody's insomnia. But if we could look, for example, at a data stream that has in it the number of hours that somebody is using their cell phone, and when they're actually online. That also includes perhaps information about the food that they've been eating that is collected from their smart refrigerator, or information about how much exercise and activity they've had, and whether or not that may be affecting their sleep. We may have a much better possibility for diagnosing some of these issues as well. These new forms of data, though, come with new kinds of challenges for researchers. Think about how difficult it may be to collect this kind of data. Usually with clinical data or with other kinds of data, we collect it intentionally for a specific research project. We train people to go out and collect the data. We have control over the whole line or the whole data flow from the moment it's created until it's used. But a lot of these kinds of things, like the Fitbit, are actually commercial devices, where the researcher may not have control over the kind of, over the whole collection and use process, over the whole workflow. Thinking about how these data are collected, usually in research we control the whole data workflow. From the moment that the data are collected, we design the instruments, we design the protocols through which the data will be collected, and then we control that data all the way through its use and eventually if it's shared or put into an archive. With a lot of the new forms of data, like you might get from these kinds of devices, however, it's a company that is designing the device, creating the platform on which the data is collected, and actually controls that data set. And so it's a new kind of working that involves more collaboration between researchers and companies, and involves thinking a little bit more carefully about where did that data come from, how was it generated, is it really going to answer the kinds of questions that we have. We also know that interpreting this data can be difficult, in part because of some of those same issues. Again, think about the typical forms of research data collection. We have people who've trained extensively on data collection and data production techniques. They know exactly what they're doing. They work very hard to make sure that the data is consistent. If we use particular instruments or devices or sensors to collect that data, we're very careful to make sure that those are consistent, that they've been validated. But when we talk about commercial devices again, we don't have as much control over the production of those devices or where that data comes from. And so we need new techniques and new ways of thinking about data. Instead of, for example, a smaller set of data that you might get in a clinical setting that has been very carefully collected by somebody who's been trained and using a standardized protocol, what we have now is much more data because we've got tracking over every single day instead of a single point in time, but that data tend to be noisier. And we need to think about new techniques for interpreting that data. And then finally, one of the biggest issues that comes with this kind of data and the ways that the insight that this data can give into our lives is that it poses new ethical challenges. How do we think about the privacy of this data? Because it may be revealing much more than we think it's revealing about us. There's a recent study that has just come out from Stanford University that claims a certain degree of success, somewhere between 80 and 90%, using a machine learning algorithm that by looking at pictures of people that they have posted online can predict their sexual orientation. We have new techniques that can reveal much more about us than we intend to be revealed from these kinds of data. And so thinking about the ethical issues that are involved in using this data, how is it controlled? Who gets to use it? What kind of consent should be given before that data can be used? In what circumstances can we use that data without consent? Is a terms of service that you click when you install an app enough to really count as an ethical use of that data? There are a lot of issues that come up around these ethical questions that I think we need to approach. And so here at the Pufendorf Institute this year, as part of the data theme, one of the great opportunities that we get is that the theme gives us the chance to think about some of these issues and how they play out in a number of different departments, among a number of different faculties across the university, and to really dig deep into these issues as we explore new kinds of data.